Over the past week and a half, quite spontaneously, out of nowhere, there are now protests in Cuba over lockdown restrictions and the slow rollout of COVID vaccinations. How does the mainstream left, American left, I should say, respond to this? Like a bunch of Pavlovian dogs salivating on cue whenever a counter-revolution backed by Western interests transpires somewhere else in the world. May I remind you, the same left that told everyone to stay home, lock themselves down, and get their marching orders from Rachel Maddow towing the liberal establishment line on MSNBC is now rooting for anti-lockdown and anti-government protests in Cuba? You got Vaush saying that he supports ending the blockade, but also the right of the Cuban people to challenge the Cuban government. Like that armchair quarterback knows anything about anything stuck in his Beverly Hills basement. You know, he doesn't leave. At least I leave my basement. AOC is also saying the same thing. And now look, they're now siding with some of the very people who they also condemn for what transpired at the Capitol on January 6th, considering that the contemporary right, consisting of Cuban Gusanos, also supports the concept of Cuban regime change. This is why the international left thinks the American left consists of a bunch of reactionary idiots. The reason why Cuba is in the position that it is in right now is because of the system that was established by Fidel Castro, a system which embraced socialism, where the public, via the state, owns the modes and means of Cuba's production, and not, say, the Italian mafia who wanted to turn Cuba into their own playground of racketeering and human trafficking, nor multinational corporations who wanted to monopolize Cuba's natural resources for the sake of export and increasing their own profit margins. Cuba is not owned by the Italian mafia, nor is Cuba owned by multinational corporations. Cuba is owned by Cuba. That's the point. Private entrepreneurs hate this concept and hate the fact that Fidel Castro dispossessed them of their sugar farms, with legitimate fears that the multinational corporations would swallow Cuban property and influence policy decisions that would corrupt the culture of Cuba and displace far more Cubans than the amount of Cubans who left for the United States because they couldn't stand the idea of sharing the wealth. Look at Hawaii, for example. That's what happened over there because there was no Cuban Revolution in Hawaii. So in retaliation, the United States placed a trade embargo on Cuba, as private corporations within the United States could not stand the fact that any financial and trade transaction involving Cuba would not benefit private corporate interests, but benefit the Cuban state, which discourages private corporations from developing within its own borders as a way to not undermine its own self-determination. For some 6 decades, this trade embargo has been in place, and for 6 decades, Cuba has remained steadfast in terms of not caving into the economic terrorism placed upon it by Wall Street, which takes us back to the present-day controversies. All of a sudden, Cuba is being denounced for censoring the internet. Oh, no! Yes, the internet that is dominated by right-wing capitalist interests. And don't let their anti-racism fool you. They are still very right-wing. Based in Silicon Valley, which is the tech wing of Wall Street, which will do everything in its power to utilize misleading propaganda about freedom and democracy as a ways and means to undermine the Cuban government. The tiny island nation is so authoritarian. Never mind the fact that the most brutal and authoritarian prison camp within Cuba is not ran by Cuba, but ran by the United States within Guantanamo Bay. Hey, remember Guantanamo Bay, liberals? Yeah, Barack Obama said he was going to close it. Guess what? It never closed down. Are there any renewed calls for Guantanamo Bay to be shut down? No. The contemporary American left, hijacked by woke liberal capitalists, wants for the supposedly oppressed Cubans to allow the regime that runs Guantanamo Bay to run all of Cuba so they can sell the island off by piecemeal to Wall Street. The bread tube anarchists and radical liberals who detest socialist regimes, authoritarian socialist regimes, want Cuba's self-determination to be dissolved in the name of what they call human rights, not realizing that implementing such perpetuates the very colonialism they claim to detest. We want the Cuban embargo to end, no doubt, but at the same time, ending the Cuban embargo should not come with the condition of the Cuban government having to entirely open its market to be privatized by Wall Street for Wall Street's benefit and not for the benefit of the Cuban people. Supporting the self-determination of the Cuban nation means supporting the Cuban government, currently not under the influence of private capital and not under the influence of neoliberalism, aka the American deep state, which the Trump supporters rail against, but at the same time demand that such an aforementioned deep state subjugates Cuba. Isn't that a contradiction? Supporting the counter-government protests backed by Anglo-Euro capitalist interests in Cuba is akin to supporting the idea that Cuba has no right to its own self-determination. It would be like supporting the Western capitalist interests that usurped the rule of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 because Queen Liliuokalani was too autocratic. Don't get suckered. This is why the theory of permanent revolution is toxic and dangerous, because permanent revolution can be exploited by the very capitalist interests that said revolution was formed to deter. A majority of the American left is wrong to support this backward Trotskyist doctrine, and they are wrong to demand change in Cuba when such a change is what will invite Wall Street to own and dominate Cuba. This must never happen. Never. The trade embargo must end, but Cuba must also be allowed to control its own economic and industrial agency, and it must be allowed to control its own borders and determine its own destiny, and not have its destiny determined by foreigners who only seek to privatize Cuba for its own purposes. Not all protests are worth supporting, and this is one of them, because it's not coming from the people. It's coming from corporate interests hijacking the proletarian aesthetic to advance their own ends. Hands off Cuba, Wall Street. It's not yours to own. Viva la revolution. This is Comrade Pella, signing off.